Alright guys, today we are going to talk about something a little bit different, or we're going to do something a little bit different. Instead of fishing, we're going to talk about a fishing topic. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I saw something over the weekend that kind of prompted me to talk about it to someone who was also into BFS fishing. So shout out to Matt who gave me this idea. He basically said, hey, why don't you talk about BFS rather than just fishing with BFS? So great idea, light bulb. I'm like, yes, perfect. I think I'm going to do that. The other reason is that I skunked on my last trip, so what better way to make a content, right? Just talk about something. So our topic today is, what is BFS? So BFS stands for Bait Finesse Systems. And essentially it's a method of fishing that uses a bait caster to cast light lures. Now, BFS has been around since the 1980s, and if I'm not mistaken, if I'm incorrect, let me know because I want to know myself. And also, I just want to say that by no means am I talking here as an expert. I'm no expert in this topic whatsoever. I'm just sharing some information that I know from other channels or from reading or from experience. And so hopefully the stuff I'm spewing here is relatively accurate. But again, if it's incorrect, I welcome criticism and corrections. So it's been around in Japan for a long time. It's just now slowly making its way to the U.S. market. Over the years, it's gotten more and more popular. Like Tactical Bassin actually has a separate segment for BFS fishing. They BFS fish. They have a separate segment for BFS gear. There's a lot of channels that are completely dedicated to BFS fishing, and in the fishing shows that I cast, more and more you see more and more companies making BFS rods and BFS reels. You also see more of gear that used to be just JDM, Japan domestic market, now slowly coming over and being available in the US. The same thing with CDM, so Chinese domestic market. So you can see more of their products actually on Amazon that you never used to see here. It's used to always be on AliExpress. Now BFS, as much as traction as it's gotten, it's still relatively unknown to a lot of people, even to a lot of anglers. So it's so one of my goals is to hopefully inform people. And a perfect example of how unknown this still is and how unmainstream it is that I was at the ISE this weekend, the International Sportsman's Expo, and there was a session there with Greg Blanchard and his crew, the Dark Horse crew, where they were basically just doing Q&A. And one guy asked about BFS, whether they use it or they plan to use it. And, Greg's response was really kind of unsure. He was like, that's the small stuff, right? And then when he turned around to the Dark Horse crew, no one really responded. Like, I think they weren't even aware of what it was. So I think it's definitely not mainstream, and I think a lot of people still don't know what it is. So hopefully that's something I can help out with here. The question is, why is this even a thing, right? Because bait casters already exist. So why is there like a subcategory for casting light lures? Well, to explain that, we have to talk about a couple of things. One, a bait caster and a spin caster. Now there are other systems like Tenkara and fly fishing, but I'm only going to cover these two here because these kind of compete in the same sphere of fishing. So these systems both have advantages and disadvantages, and one of the big disadvantage of a bait caster or a con is that it's prone to backlashing, and I'll explain that here in a second. The main disadvantage and the reason why I got into BFS of the spinning reel is that it's prone to line twist, and I'll also explain that here. So, all right, so why do we have BFS when we already have bait casters? Well, just let me explain a little bit what a backlash is. This is only for people who are either new to angling or have never used a bait caster. So a backlash essentially happens. So when you're casting a bait caster, right, and you push this thumb lever down here, and that basically puts the reel into free spool, right? Nothing is stopping it from spinning. So when you are about to cast, you push the thumb lever down, you flick your lure out, and the weight of the lure, the mass of the lure, starts going in the direction you're casting. And what that's doing is it's pulling the line. It's pulling the line like this, right? So now, as long as the rate of pull of that line is the same as the spin rate of the spool, there's no problem. What happens when when the speed of the pull, if it slows down and the spool is spinning faster than the line pull is, it causes something called a backlash. It's actually also called an overrun, and it's an overrun because what's happening is the spool is overrunning the rate of pull of the line. So let me just show you guys what happens. Okay, so I took that out so you can kind of see it a little better. So when the rate of pull is the same as the rate of the spin of the spool, no problems. But what happens when this line stops moving and this spool starts to keep spinning? Watch what happens. You see all that? See that? That bird nesting? That's called a backlash. Where the line slows down, but the rate of spin of the spool is faster than the line being pulled. The spool is overrunning the line, and it causes this big bird nest, and can be a huge mess. If it's bad enough, you're probably better off just cutting the line and respooling. Yeah, it's a pain in the butt. So that's what a backlash is. Now, again, what does this have to do with casting light lures? Well, when you're casting a lure that has more mass, it's bigger, or if it's even bigger and more aerodynamic, it is less prone to being affected by wind. Okay, so even on a windy day, if you're casting a lure that's heavy enough, the rate of pull of that lure is going to probably maintain until it's hits the water and you stop the free spool. But what happens when you throw a light lure is it's extremely prone to being affected by wind. So when you're casting a light lure, it's prone to slowing down quickly, or even sometimes just like almost stopping, depending on how light the lure is and how like unaerodynamic it is, and that causes backlashing. And that's why it's sometimes it's really hard or almost impossible if you're casting a really light lure using a traditional bait caster, given you're using the heavier lines and you've got the spool fully spooled with line. It's really hard. So that's one of the problems. That's why when you see like bass anglers, when they start throwing lighter lures or more finesse type lures, they will switch to a spinner setup because it does not have the same problem that bait casters have, because spinning reels, the spool of the spinning reel does not spin. Okay, this does not spin. When you're casting, what happens is you flip the bail, and all you're doing is pulling the line out of the spool just like this. Okay. So what happens when you start reeling it in is the process of reeling it in, and the bail winding it in. And there are some things that you do that can make it worse. For example, instead of manually flipping the bail or closing the bail, you just like start reeling and have that process close the bail. That over time, every time you do that, it causes a little line twist, and over time it gets worse and worse. And the way you spool a spinning gear also has the potential of causing the line twist. So basically, the more and more you do it, the worse it gets. Now, supposedly there are some things you can do to mitigate the line twist, but I've tried all those, and none of them worked for me completely. And I just completely got annoyed with it. And that is why I actually switched to BFS, because I did not want to deal with line twist. Now, for you guys out there who just bait and wait, essentially that's pretty much all I use spinning gear now, is when I'm doing bait and wait. It's not a pronounced problem because you're not constantly casting and recasting and recasting. You're just casting and waiting and casting and waiting. So it's not a big problem that you probably notice. So we have the problem of the backlash, and then for the bait caster, and then we have the problem of the line twist for the spinning gear, right? So that is what BFS addresses. Now, the other problem with the traditional bait caster with regards to casting a light lure is the ability of the lure to get the spool spinning to start free spooling out. If you have a light lure, and here's a traditional bait caster, right? This is my dedicated swim bait, like large bait reel. This is notice how look at how big this spool is, and most of the time you're putting on heavier line on here, so it holds more line. First of all, it's a bigger spool, it holds more line, and the line you're typically putting on these are heavier. So if you're trying to cast a light lure and you're trying to use the mass of that lure to get this spool to start spinning out, you're using that lure basically to start pulling this reel, it's difficult to get it started because this is a lot heavier. So what pretty much what BFS did to address that is to lighten the spool, and they've done that in several ways. One, they've changed the now this is not true for all manufacturers, but I'm just telling you what various manufacturers have done to lighten the spool. One is they changed the spool material to something lighter, like the Shimano MGLs. They're using titanium. I've also made the spools smaller, and if you look at the spool, look how shallow that is. A shallow spool does two things. One, there's less spool material, so it reduces the weight, and it forces you to not put as much line on the spool. That is one of the disadvantages of BFS, by the way, is the line capacity of the spools. They're very small. To compensate for that, you have to go with lighter lines. Again, all to do with lightening up the spool. Lastly, some manufacturers also poured out their spools. You see that in there? You see how you can see the line from the inside? That's because this spool is extremely ported, meaning they've taken out a lot of the materials to make the spool even lighter. So get lighter spools so that lighter lures can pull the line, has enough mass to get this thing to start spinning. Okay, that's it. That's primarily what a BFS system is. It's a regular bait caster that uses a smaller and lighter, shallower spool. Let's go over some of the pros and cons, okay? So some of the pros for BFS is that you're using lighter lures. So when you're using lighter lures, you're probably going to get more bites, but that means small and big bites. Because when something's smaller, obviously smaller fish will go for it more than they will with something that's bigger. Now, that's no guarantee, because trust me, this has happened to me a lot where the fish I catch is almost as big, or where the lure I'm using is almost as big as the fish that went for it. So it's, depends on the species of fish you're going for. The more aggressive ones will go after bigger fish. But it's kind of like the concept of these guys that use this huge like swim baits and glide baits. They're gonna get. Trust me, I've tried using those baits, and I've never caught a fish with them. So when you're using bigger baits, you're reducing the amount of bites you have, but the bites you're gonna probably get are gonna be huge fish, right? You're eliminating a lot of the smaller fish, but I think that's less fun. if you're just a regular angler, I think just catching fish is what you want. So you want more fun. So I think for BFS, a smaller lure means more fun. I just take that as a pro. A lighter gear means less tiring. So if you're chucking a freaking A-rig, you will feel it. You're going to have a lot of rest breaks in between. If you're throwing a huge glide bait, you're going to have rest periods in between. But if I'm chucking a 1 gram, 2 gram lure with a one-handed rod, I can do that all day, not even think about it. So it's less tiring. So you have the ability to fish tighter areas where casting room is limited, and you need to be accurate with casting. Extreme fishing, and when there's a lot of shrubs or creek fishing, the BFS system really shines there because you can use lighter lures, you can be super accurate, and you have the ability to cast without a lot of space. So, like for example, in the space of trout fishing, you can't fly fish in tight areas, but you can with BFS. So yeah, big pro. Now some of the cons, because you are using light lures, even when you're using BFS, the lure is still prone to being affected by the wind. So if it's a really windy day, you can't use super light lures. If it's a so you're kind of like limited to areas where it's protected from the wind. If you're in a tournament where you don't really want to catch a lot of small fish, you just want to catch ones that are keepers, and you don't want to waste time reeling in and releasing small fish, then BFS might be a disadvantage because time is a premium when you're doing tournament fishing. The small lures are harder to see. One of the standards that people have these days for how good a BFS reel is whether it can cast a 1 gram lure. Trust me, I'm one of those people. I use that kind of as a metric, but it's a little impractical. When you're casting a lure that's that small and light, my biggest problem is it's hard to see the lure. So if you can't see the lure, you can't see when it's landing, you can't stop the spooling, and so you can have backlashes that way. So that's one of the problems I have with super tiny lures is it's really hard to see the lure. And plus, when you're casting a 1 gram lure versus a 2 gram lure, the fish just gonna go for that 1 gram lure will probably be big enough to also go for the 2 gram lure, unless it's like a little shad. So yeah, that's my 2 cents about that. It's also still relatively the choices here in the U.S. market is, relatively small if you compare it to like the Asian market. The Asian market is way ahead of the U.S. market. If you are brave enough to expand yourself and buy directly overseas, your selection and the price range, the affordability is just exponentially better. I'm going to tell you. I'm not going to go into like where I buy stuff because I don't want to have you guys do the same thing, have a bad experience, and then say, hey, you know what, dude, I tried that, it didn't work out for me. So I'm just saying that if you buy overseas, you have a lot more choices than you do here. If you buy directly from Japan, when you're buying JDM products, it's cheaper because of the exchange rate. So I've always bought my high-end JDM products directly from Japan because of the exchange rate. So anyways, so that are some of the pros and cons. I don't want to go too much into detail about other things because I want to hopefully make this a series, and so I can go into other things in other episodes where I'm more in detail about specific topics. Now, one of the questions that I always, it's not so much a question, but comments that people make about BFS is it's just for small fish. And I can tell you, that is the farthest from the truth. Now, BFS fishing, because you are using lighter lures, you are going to get more bites because you're going to get bites from small and big fish, but it's not just for small fish. Trust me. If you have a lure in front of a fish, I don't think the fish cares how big he is. If it's hungry and it's in front of their face. In fact, I would think that lighter lures, smaller lures, sometimes may actually, trigger a bite from bigger fish, because they may be in a time of year where they don't want to expend a lot of energy, and catching smaller bait may be something that's just easy for them to gulp down, and you may get that. Now, I've hooked onto like big bass stripers. I got a salmon last year, so using like a 4-pound leader, and so it's definitely not just for small fish. So hopefully that dispels that thinking that BFS fishing is just for small fish. So anyways, that is my talk about BFS. Hopefully that provides some information to some people who never heard of it or may be interested in looking into it. All right, guys, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.